Anyone still ready? If not, pass mine to the center, please. This is the mini outline in row 2. Do I have everyone's paper? And does everyone have a mini outline? No one is speaking, so the answer is yes. Okay, good. Yeah. Good. All right. Today we're just going to start in what in effect is our beginning of our discussion of Islam. Although as you see, we're going to continue on with this next week a little greater length. This is really meant to provide you with the absolute origins of the religion of Islam, especially in the person of Muhammad. In previous sessions, we've been talking a good deal about the Roman Empire, and here we're going to begin to turn to one of the civilizations that really because of the window, because of the window of opportunity that was founded because of Rome's fall, it allowed new civilizations to come to be where previously Rome had been dominant. And at least one of those civilizations has become very important in the discussion now is Islam. Again, for really to some degree, this discussion really requires very little justification in as much as you will notice the enormous size, the amount of adherents of Islam in this day, and just how much it's growing. The origins of this new religion, Islam, begin with Muhammad, and many historians have always tried to figure out as much as possible on what they could say about Muhammad's life. This is extremely difficult, even for the best meaning of historians, because our sources about Muhammad are, especially his early days, are really not that great. So we actually don't have a full biography until around a century after his life. And when people start writing about Muhammad, they are also people of the same religion. So of course, they're going to paint him in a very positive light. So far as we can tell, we don't even know the exact birth date of those in the 6th century. Muhammad was born to poor parents. His parents seem to have died when he was relatively young, leaving him an orphan. Muhammad, though, will go on to marry very well. In his 20s, he will end up getting married to a wealthy widow, who actually made her money in as a merchant in the caravan business, carrying goods. And in fact, it's at this point in which we really start to care about Muhammad's career. Muhammad, again, really in his early manhood, begins to change from being someone who previously had been a merchant, and he begins to become then a religious figure, preaching things about, for instance, that those who said there's more than one God are wrong. There's only one God. God is just. God will judge all people. God should be the one who determines how you behave. All of these things. Now, you may say to yourself, just again, based upon those messages, this does not seem very different from some things that either Christians or Jews were preaching. And in fact, Muhammad would say that I am actually not preaching a new religion at all. what he would say is, in effect, that if you took all of the sort of the things that have been added over the centuries to either Christianity or Judaism, you stripped it back to its basics, you scrubbed it clean of everything that's been added by humans, what you would get, in effect, is his religion. So he's teaching is just a purified version of those other monotheistic religions that were much more popular when he began to preach. It was going to be a challenge, though, for Muhammad to get his message out. And we do think that this area here that he comes from, today is Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, was an area that was inhospitable to live and really very difficult in some ways to be able to travel out of, to be able to take this message elsewhere. Particularly important for our story, or place where he comes from originally, Mecca here, and a little further up to the northwest, this is Medina. And this is part of this sort of area right along the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula, when you would see merchants travel up until finally up in the north they would hit the Mediterranean. Then their goods can go further. And that, in fact, this was a very popular passage at the time. Really, in some ways, a lot of the Arabian Peninsula was an area that was scorchingly hot. It's filled with deserts. Those areas that do not have deserts have mountains. And in effect, really large portions of this area that Muhammad comes from are completely uninhabitable by human beings. And really, some of those cities I showed you on the west coast are areas in which people usually strategically have placed cities at some of the few places in which you can actually get enough water. So, especially for merchants, before they stopped, they would rest at these various places and refresh themselves at oases. And again, most of you will know what an oasis is in the desert. Some people have referred to the city of Mecca, when Muhammad was born, as a long, drawn-out oasis, an area of the desert where you can actually get water. But on top of that, you can also you can rest a little while on journeys, you can sell goods, you can trade, that kind of thing. And we don't think when Muhammad is first born, there's really a very complicated government in this region either. People cared a lot about familial structure. There were elder men in charge, but really it's not a very complicated government at all. Some people would say, though, as the 6th century goes on, new changes are detected, specifically throughout in Mecca, but also throughout the entire Arabian Peninsula. And in fact, part of the problems that Muhammad is going to encounter is that, in effect, Mecca is doing too well in the Arabian Peninsula. Many cities have its population are beginning to go up and up. And for a region in which they really can't support that much human life, there's really limited in terms of resources. That is a significant difficulty. We also think that one of the questions is, especially specifically when it comes to Mecca, is its religious status. And it actually, some people forget that the city of Mecca was not just an important city as a result of Islam. In fact, even before Islam becomes a religion, it was already a religious center and really a pilgrimage area. Some of those same merchants who were traveling to the north would stop at Mecca. And located there is what most people tend to think is a black meteorite. So a meteorite that crashed to Earth at some point, that because of the connections with the heavens had a sort of a spiritual air to it. People felt that this must be something from above. And today, as you can see, you can't actually see the meteorite stone itself. It's actually hidden behind this thing that in Arabic is called the Kaaba, which is just a term that means the cube. And they placed this sort of this cube around the black meteorite, which still, again, exists in the city of Mecca. And up until the point in which Muhammad begins preaching and becomes dominant finally. The Kaaba was this place that all kinds of pagans from around the Arabian Peninsula would come to venerate the stone as being of spiritual significance. And we think that the Arabs at the time, before Muhammad, were generally speaking polytheists. And they believed that there were all sorts of nature gods, demons, various spirits in the world. So they certainly believed in something, but they didn't believe in sort of one god up until this point. We also know, too, that within Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula, there were definitely Jews and Christians there already, some of whom may have influenced some of Muhammad's teachings. In any case, we don't think Mecca, though, really, if there was one thing that was allowing the city to survive, more than anything else, it was commerce. This was a city built on merchants, built on this constant stream of people coming in and trading. This wasn't something that was good for the economy of Mecca, but we think added to tensions that were already floating in the air because of this overpopulation problem. Especially many of these old families that had always dominated in this region begin to lose a lot of power as a result of merchants having gained so much power and money. It was Muhammad who begins to ask very seriously, how does God or religion fit into any of these problems that his area was having? Muhammad begins to feel that unlike the Jews and Christians, Muslims do not have a body of scripture to turn to. But he really feels that they should be worshiping the same God, simply under the Arabic name. The name Allah simply is the Arabic term for God, nothing else. Scripture, though, would be coming. One day, Muhammad would go out of town to go to this cave that was outside the city of Mecca. And he would actually go into these periods of contemplation there. One day, Muhammad tells us that a voice came to him. And ultimately, it seems it was an angel who would basically serve as a conduit between God, between Allah, and him. And the first revelation that comes through this is, recite in the name of the Lord who created man from a clot of blood. In fact, that term recite is important because that verb they used as part of this first revelation is actually they come to use that verb as the foundation for the title of this collection of revelations, the Quran, which is the recitings, the recitations, these things that Muhammad was saying. And over a very long period, it must be said. In fact, it was said that Muhammad got revelations for a period of over 22 years. And it actually takes a long time to get all of this down. And we'll talk more about it when we talk about the Quran itself, that this was not an instantaneous production. It had to be then compiled by his followers into one book. Now, if nothing else, the Quran would have all of a sudden really crystallized the Arabic language. I mean, really, Arabic didn't have a standard form, and really wherever Islam is going to go in the future, Arabic as a language will go. And Muslims really believe it's important to read the word of Scripture in its original. So that's part of the reason why people would learn Arabic as a language. More important, though, of course, for the purposes of religion, this book, the Quran, will really paint this image of a new religion. The term Islam, which is used to describe this religion, it comes from the verb meaning to surrender or to submit. So a Muslim is someone who submits to God, who surrenders to God. Sometimes people get a little confused. Notice that Islam is always the name of the religion, and then Muslim is a follower of this religion, an adherent of Islam. Muhammad really believes that he was the prophet meant to convey God's message to the Arabs, just as our earlier prophets, like say Abraham, had also had missions to deliver the word of God to other people. And in fact, Muhammad never denied that there had been other prophets that had come before, many of whom would actually be familiar to you from the Bible, people you've heard of. But what he would argue was that he was the final prophet, and there would be no after him. Muhammad's message was that there's a single, all-powerful God who had created the universe. If you chose to follow God, follow His command, then you would gain heaven. And if you chose not to, there were terrible punishments in hell. And again, Muhammad taught that worship is extremely important to acknowledge God's power, to acknowledge human weakness. But in addition to revering God, it's also necessary to do things on earth, like, for instance, be generous to the poor, unfortunately. Muhammad also, we think, was someone who had a very uncompromising stance on monotheism. One of the early stories about Muhammad, for instance, is that he goes to the queue of the Kaaba, in which people over the centuries had left all kinds of statues of various gods. Supposedly he took his staff and he just began smashing all of the statues of other gods. Supposedly the only one he left was an image of the Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus to stand. Now, we know now, of course, it's not really an unusual thing to be a strict monotheist. At the time, though, in Mecca, this was seen as bizarre. And not only just bizarre, but threatening. Now, bear in mind that one of Mecca's claims to fame was that it had this famous pilgrimage site that all sorts of people who were polytheists would come and worship at. Muhammad really seemed to threaten that entire business by saying that there could be only one God. On top of that, too, we think that Muhammad, his teachings about, for instance, listen, if you become a believer in this religion, everyone is equal. I don't care what your family is. I don't care what your profession is. All Muslims are meant to be equal to one another. That was also not something that many people wanted to hear. People thought by blood or by money you ought to be different. So that was something also that was very controversial in his own time. As a result of all this, many of the leaders of various groups in Mecca begin to turn on Muhammad and his followers in the early days. And in fact, some of them actually staged an economic boycott. They refused to do any business with Muslims in the hopes that they would go away. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. They had to earn a living. And so what ends up happening is that both Muhammad and his early followers choose to leave the city of Mecca. Supposedly only around 200 early followers would actually accompany him out of the city. And this date, this happens in the year 622, 622. And the reason I said that this is so important is because this is actually the year that Muslims start their calendar. This is year one for Muslims. The event itself is usually referred to by the Arabic term hijra, which means emigration, going out from, migrating out from. This commemorates the date in which Muhammad leaves the city of Mecca. The other question, of course, you have, which is an obvious question, is where does he go? Please.
Sorry, I have a quick question. Did you say emigration or immigration?
Emigration, so he's going out from. This is not immigration, that's going into. So it's coming out from. Exactly. Please.
And Hijra is the year that was? Or
So it's the event itself.
Okay.
Sorry, which happens in 622.
Okay.
But thank you for clarifying that. Where Muhammad and his followers choose to go is that other city I pointed to on the map, the city of Medina, which is around 200 miles away to the north. Now, believe it or not, at this point, although Muhammad was being kicked out of Mecca, in Medina, they were actually calling for him to come. Medina was another city, similar in some ways, in that had a lively merchant business, but in fact, there was a near civil war breaking out in the city. And they were desperate to be able to find someone to mediate between all the various people who were fighting against one another. And Muhammad had this reputation already as being a spiritual leader, being able to give direction to people. So they said, well, let's give it a try. And they actually welcomed Muhammad to come in and to basically to reorganize the city of Medina according to his new principles of this religion he was preaching. This is really, in some ways, where Muhammad gets the opportunity now to take Islam and begin to institute it, both as a religion and really as a government. And in fact, in early Islam, even later Islam, there would be no distinction between the two. You can have a spiritual leader who's also at the same time a governmental leader, and that was not seen as a problem. And so Muhammad begins to have all sorts of various statements, first about how to govern, but also things about, how should people marry? Can you drink alcohol? No. How do you, all these kind of things about what kind of foods you can eat. Really, in some ways, creating an entire community. And his goal was really, as much as possible, to bring together all Arabs into one religion, all people who live in the Arabian Peninsula. This is meant to be their religion. And he really, as much as possible, he wanted to keep Islam free from some of the problems that he saw, for instance, in Christianity. For instance, he really didn't want there to be a lot of controversies over what was the correct doctrine, what was heresy, which he felt really would just distract. Ultimately, Muhammad comes up with what he referred to as 5 pillars that mark out what you had to do, the basics of what you have to do to be a Muslim. The first of these is very simple. You have to recite your faith. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. That is the recitation that's necessary for all Muslims. But notice, by the way, how bare bones that is. It's not like a long creed or anything. It's a relatively simple statement. He also said that 5 times a day, a pious Muslim is supposed to pray in the direction of the city of Mecca. So notice how, by the way, Mecca will continue to have a very important place in the Muslim world. And that's even after Islam expands far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. In addition, good Muslims are supposed to give money to the poor on a regular basis. So almsgiving. A good Muslim, the 4th thing, is that during 1 month a year, some of you will know that this month is called Ramadan. You don't have to know it, of course, but during the month of Ramadan, you have to fast during daylight hours. When exactly Ramadan falls, by the way, changes because they're using a lunar calendar, but they have to do that for 1 month a year. Please.
Do they actually just not eat, or is it they don't eat meat?
Oh no, I mean you're not during daylight hours. You're not supposed to eat. Yeah. What's that? Right?
When's daylight hours? Just like when the sun's out?
Yeah, precisely when the sun's out. So it differs slightly, where you are depending on where the sun goes, rises and sets.
So just a lot of midnight snacks for that month.
Yeah, no, it's acceptable that you have to eat when when it's down, but while the sun's out, you're not supposed to be eating. So Muslim countries, again, food grinds to a halt during Ramadan, good day. The last thing that you had to do to be a good Muslim was make a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to the city of Mecca. So again, Mecca still remains central to Islam. And you'll notice, by the way, they didn't actually rip out the Kaaba. They just now, and rather than venerate it, they just use it as, they circulate it as part of this pilgrimage to the city of Mecca. So in fact, the Kaaba doesn't go anywhere, and the city of Mecca still remains spiritually important. It's just now for a new religion, as opposed to polytheistic religion before. Nevertheless, we do think that Muhammad runs into some difficulties. It doesn't appear that his religion took off really among some Christians or Jews who lived within the Arabian Peninsula. And in fact, he ended up getting so annoyed with some of the Jewish community at Medina that he actually drove them out of the city because they were not accepting his claims in his new religion. Nevertheless, we think that the majority of the rest of Muhammad's life ends up really, in addition to just ruling over Medina, he ends up pushing continually for the conversion of pagans in the Arabian Peninsula to try to unify this area under his new religion. And in fact, because of his work in Medina and formulating this new religion even more clearly, eventually, although Mecca had kicked him out initially, Mecca would one day actually open up its gates again to him and welcome him again with open arms. So eventually they'll get a sort of hero's welcome again in his own city. Nevertheless, eventually Muhammad will go the way of all flesh, and he'll die in 632. It's at this point that there's a really open question among Muslims that did one need the prophet to be able to continue this religion? And in fact, it was not entirely clear what the fate of Islam would be. But more to come on that on Monday. All right. Have a good weekend, folks. Thank you.